This video is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon. Hi guys, I'm here with a video showing you how I made my entire Bombshell Raven cosplay. To start off, I made a pattern and I used the duct tape method to do this, and that's basically where you just wrap yourself in like cellophane and then tape it all up and draw on your guidelines. I have an entirely different video on how I do most of my patterns. However, if you want to just kind of skip this step, I do have the bodysuit pattern available on my Etsy and store Envy. Anyways, once I have my pattern all drawn out from the duct tape, I went ahead and transferred that onto some spare material I had for a mock-up. This is a bed sheet I got from a thrift store. That is the material that I always make my mock-ups out of, because at like thrift stores, bed sheets are like $1 or $2, at least at my local one it is. So yeah, I traced those patterns out onto my mock-up material, cleaned up the lines from the duct tape pattern, added in some seam allowance, and then cut that all out. Once I had all of my pieces cut out, I went ahead and sewed the entire thing together. If you don't know what a mock-up is, it's basically like a test run of your final garment. So what you want to do is sew it all together, try it on, draw on any changes or pin any changes that need to be made. Like for me, I needed to take in quite a few seams here and there, and then sew that down into place, try it on again, make sure it was fitting right, do any more changes that needed to be made, try it on again, and when I was finally happy with the fit, I go ahead and cut off any excess fabric that might have been like left over from me taking in the seams, redraw on any like lines for the seams that like I need to stand out, and then take the entire garment apart again. And that is how you get your final pattern, which should fit you pretty much perfectly. Enjoy this random snippet of my cat bathing himself, because he's fluffy and I thought he looked cute. Alright, enough cat. Now back to actually making things. So the next thing that I needed to do was take my final pattern and transfer that onto the actual material, which is this blue satin-like material. Pin or weigh down your pattern pieces and cut those out. Next, I needed to start sewing the garment together, and to start off, I sewed all of the seams on the side, like the front, the sides, not the back center though. That's not done until later. And in each of these seams, I added in some light blue piped bias tape. Make sure when you are placing your piped bias, because you're going to want to sew as close to the piped part as possible so that only the piped part is sticking out of the seam and not the flat bias tape part. So just be aware when you are adding it in that you pin and make it match your seam allowance. So if you have a very small seam allowance, then part of the bias tape is probably going to stick out from between the two pieces of fabric, like the blue satin fabric. However, my seam allowance accounted for it was basically the same exact size as this piped bias was, so I just placed it even with the other two pieces of fabric and it came out perfectly. I used a straight stitch on my basic regular settings for sewing this entire garment. Once all of the side seams were finished, I sewed down the center back and sewed that closed, and then folded open or pressed open that back seam and laid a zipper right along the seam line and sewed that into place. There is no piped bias on the back seam, by the way, at least not in mine, because that's where I needed a zipper to be. Anyways, there are instructions on the zipper packets. I used an invisible zipper for this, and there's instructions on how to sew it, so I'm pretty sure that I just followed those. Once the zipper was sewn into place, it was time to open up that back seam along where the zipper was placed so that I could actually access the zipper. I used a seam ripper to do this. Next, it was time to add this wide trim that she has along the top of her bodysuit. And to do that, I again just cut out fabric using the pattern from earlier and just cutting off the top half and then sewing it together so it makes like one full trim. Anyways, I used that section of my pattern to create the trim and then cut that out onto the blue satin material, and then I placed the trim onto the front of the bodysuit and then folded over the raw edges over the back of the bodysuit, so now the raw edge of the bodysuit is encased in the seam or the hem of the trim, and then I pinned that down. Yeah, I know it seems kind of weird that I'm just kind of overlapping the fabrics rather than making it like a top half. However, I didn't want to lengthen the bodysuit any more than it was because it already fit how I wanted, and I wanted that extra thickness of fabric at the top there because I thought it looked nicer. So this is the way I decided to go about it. Once that was placed or pinned into place, I went ahead and sewed that down. Now the next step is to sew the bottom half of this trim into place. And to do that, I folded over the raw edge and tucked that in, and then slipped in some piped bias, making sure the pipe part was sticking out, and pinned that down. You want to make sure that you pull on both the trim and the bodysuit section, but not too much. You just want to make sure that the wrinkle like there's no wrinkles on the bodysuit. Like the fabric that's underneath the trim isn't getting wrinkled because that's going to make it kind of sit wonky. You want both layers of fabric to be nice, flat, and even with one another so that it's not like pulling in the bodysuit and there's going to be this weird wrinkle coming from the trim now, or the trim's not sitting really loose, so the trim's just going to like puff out and wrinkle. You want to make sure the fabric is flat and even with one another. By the way, to help cut or fold over fabrics wherever there's curves, just cut little tiny slits every now and then to make it like almost like a separate piece of fabric so that it curves a bit easier. Fold in the back side of this trim as well, like where the zipper is, because you don't want just like a raw edge there either. Once that is in place, sew it all down, including that back edge that's along the zipper. I took some small white ribbon and added 4 little loops, 2 at the front and 2 at the back, so that I could attach some invisible like bra straps to my bodysuit later to help it stay in place. And the bodysuit is done, so the next thing I did was move on to gloves, and for these gloves I just bought blue satin gloves off of eBay, and then I ripped open one of the seams on the outer side, I believe that it is, and I added in some piped bias tape, then sewed that shut again. That's so much easier than making gloves from scratch. Anyways, now that the gloves were done, I moved on to the skirt-like part of her costume. I don't actually know what the word for this piece is. It's kind of like a skirt, however, it's open in the front. It only goes from like the front-ish area of one hip all around the back to the other hip, and I don't know what else it's called. Anyways, I used a measuring tape to figure out how long I wanted the skirt to be and how much I wanted it to cover or not cover, and then I added in like an inch for seam allowance and cut out just a really long rectangle. I had this long cut of blue satin left. I think it was about a yard or a yard and a half-ish, I'm pretty sure. So I just cut a giant rectangle from one end of that to the other end of that. I also cut out a small band that fits around my waist, and I'm pretty sure that band was about 3 inches wide, and then I just measured it to fit from one hip to the other hip, the area that I wanted it to sit in. I rolled over the bottom edge of the skirt, which is what you just saw me do there, and sewed that down, and then I rolled over the edges of the side of the skirt pieces and then sewed that down. Whew, sorry, that was a lot to explain and I couldn't keep up with the footage, but hopefully you guys got the idea of what's happening. So at this point I have my band my waistband section pressed in half. I ironed that in half, and then I also folded in the raw edges and iron that down as well, just because that will make this entire process of pinning the skirt to it a lot easier. So I recommend doing that first. And then I pinned the skirt into place, and because I needed it to ruffle, I pinned the skirt at one end and at the other end and in the center, and then I just started ruffling the material in between all of those points. This makes it easier to just make sure the ruffles are like even and one side doesn't end up way more ruffled than the other. Once you're happy with the ruffles, go ahead and sew that down. Be sure that you are catching all layers of the fabric in this stitch. So make sure that both sides, front and back of the waistband, are getting caught in the stitches as well as the skirt fabric. I also sewed snaps onto either end of the skirt and onto the spot in the bodysuit where I wanted them to attach to. You can also add a snap to the center back to make sure that the back doesn't slip down in case it sits a little bit loose. However, I didn't find that problem with mine, so I just had the two at the front. Now on to the little gem parts of her costume. To make the gems, I used resin mixed with red food dye, and then I molded it in these metal baking molds that are just dome shapes. I don't know exactly what they're used for, I don't bake, but you can see the shape of mold that I'm using here. I sprayed this mold with mold release spray before pouring the resin, by the way. Every resin is different, so if you want to know how to mix your resin, read the instructions that come with it. I only made 3 gems. I let these fully cure for the time that the box said to. I also checked it, making sure that it was hardened before I took it out. And then before I took it out, I popped this in the freezer for an hour or 2. And that makes it so much easier to get this resin out. Usually I can't get these gems out if I don't put them in the freezer first, because the freezer shrinks the gem ever so slightly, and then it makes the mold, the metal pan, a little bit more slippery, even like around, like in between the gem and the pan, so you can just pop them out. To make the gold gem holder piece, I cut the bottom off of soda cans, added a little bit of hot glue around the edges just so that they weren't sharp, and then covered that in gold paint. I used my airbrush for this, however spray paint works too. I find that any paint on this kind of tends to chip off, even spray paint that said that it's made from metal, so don't really have a solution for that. However, it's easy enough to touch up later. I made these little round dome pieces out of some gold clay and then glued that onto 2 of the gem holders using contact cement. These are the pieces that go at the hips. If you look at reference photos, there's that tiny little detail of just this random bubble attached to it, like this gold bubble shaped gem thing. So that's what those are supposed to be. And then I used hot glue to add the gems onto the gold gem holder things. I also used hot glue to add a little bit of extra security to those little gold dome pieces as well. Then I used contact cement to glue those completed gem pieces onto the skirt. Again, I'm gluing the two that have the little gold dome piece to the skirt. The other one I save later to attach to the cape. Now I'm working on the cape. For the cape part, I had just got a really big cut of this sheer dark blue material and basically just used that giant rectangle that I got as the cape. However, for the hood, I did cut off a section and traced a hood from one of my jackets out, making it slightly bigger, and that's how I got the pattern for this big fluffy hood that she has. Right now I'm using my iron to press down all of the raw edges. I'm folding them over twice to prep them for sewing. I find it easier to iron the edges for this kind of fabric first. Otherwise, like just pinning it and sewing it, I find it to be like way too finicky still. Pressing it definitely helped keep the hem a lot more even and straight and flat and nice and smooth. I sewed down all of the raw edges, so the sides and bottom of the cape and then the front part of the hood, and then I attached the hood, the bottom of the hood, to the top of the cape. The cape, the top of the cape, is a bit longer than my hood. I didn't want my hood to be that overwhelming, so it is a tiny bit shorter. So the excess remaining on either side, I just fold over twice and pin that into place so that the hem will look nice and smooth and not all jaggedy. Then I sew that down. Here I'm just repinning and getting ready to sew down the raw edges that were left over from the top of the cape that I mentioned earlier, because my hood doesn't stretch this far. Should also note that I wanted it to be like have excess at the top of the cape because that part does need to meet in the center, and I didn't want the hood to also be that far forward meeting in the center. So it might look a little odd now, but when it's all done, it looks okay. Speaking of meeting in the center, I went ahead and attached a snap to the inside of the piece that's going to sit on top and to the outside of the piece that's going to sit on bottom, and then a piece of Velcro to the bottom of the piece, or the inside of the piece that is going to sit on the bottom. So the Velcro should be resting against your skin, and then it should be snap part, and then nothing on the outside. These snaps are to connect the cape together at the center, and then the Velcro is to adhere one side of the black necktie. Speaking of the black necktie, I sewed that into place onto only one side, the side without the Velcro, of the cape. And to make this black necktie, it's ribbon, it's black ribbon that I had lying around. And then on the very outside of the cape, remember where we didn't add any Velcro or snaps to, I glued that extra gem from earlier to that part. Alright, it's time for the last piece, which is the headbands. To create the little devil horns, I had devil horn clips lying around, and so I just made a mold of those, casted those out of EVA foam clay, sanded those down a little bit to make sure they were all nice and smooth looking, coated them with a couple layers of wood glue, and then painted them with blue acrylic paint. Then I took this wide headband that I had lying around, or I think I got it from the dollar store. I don't remember which one. It's not important. Anyways, I took that headband and I covered it in some extra satin material I had from the bodysuit. I just took a big chunk of this scrap fabric, glued that into place with hot glue, and then cut off the excess and trimmed it down quite a bit around the edge. However, you don't want to trim it fully away because you do need some fabric left over to fold over the edges so you don't see the edge of the headband that's underneath. I glued down those edges using hot glue, and to help fold these over, I did that thing that I mentioned earlier where you just cut little slits in to make the edges have smaller sections to them because it makes it easier to fold this way. And once all of those were folded over, I took a hot glue and I just created my hot glue gun, and I just created a zigzag line all the way around the underneath of the headband, and this is just to add a little bit of extra grip to the headband because I did cover the actual grip on the headband in this slippery satin fabric, so I want to make sure it wasn't going to fall off my head. The final thing was to glue the little devil horns into place. I found out the positioning I wanted by looking in a mirror, and then I put contact cement in that spot and contact cement onto the devil horns and attached the two together. I should note that the shoes were some blue pair of heels that I found at a thrift store, which you could totally find online. And then the tights were just fishnet tights that I got off of eBay. And that finishes it up for this cosplay. Again, I do have the pattern for the bodysuit on my store Envy and Etsy, and if you want to see more videos like this, be sure to check out my channel, subscribe, and stick around. If you want to see final photos, those are up on my website and Instagram.